Good afternoon, First Lutheran Cincinnati, and welcome to midweek prayer this week. So happy that you're able to join us today. Today is, of course, Veterans Day. For those of you who are aware of that, Veterans Day is a day where we remember all of those who have defended our country, who have served in some sort of capacity. In keeping us safe, particularly from enemies both inside and outside. And Veterans Day kind of evolved out of a larger global holiday known as Armistice Day. So at the end of World War I, back in 1918, on November 11th, uh, a bunch of the different sides that were fighting together, the leaders of those particular empires sort of came together and signed what we call an armistice or a treaty, just sort of signaling the end of this giant world war. Of course, we know several years later another war broke out, much along the same lines of the same sort of countries, but that's something that we remember today particularly was this end to a long world war and a transition sort of from what we would call like global imperialism and colonialism. This sort of you have these states that are in charge of so many places around the world. They're colonizing places, they're pushing people out, and they're trying to get people to conform to what they want to do. And it's transitioning to something a little different in this period of history. And so my point here, I think, is this is a difficult time, both the war and what followed after the war. You had periods of hyperinflation and economic sort of devastation of different countries, particularly like in Germany, I know. And then you have the Great Depression that comes a little bit later. So this change that the world is experiencing is difficult. They're not going back to the status quo. I think we don't necessarily have the same thing that's going on, but I think we are experiencing a time of change that is kind of difficult for us. And so I think the question is, we're acknowledging this, and what's a faithful way that we can be in this time and acknowledge the difficulty? I was doing a little bit of reading in one of my classes, and I came across the idea of lament. And lament is sort of it's a term that we use sometimes in when we're reading the Psalms. You'll kind of see sometimes a psalm that where David is talking about how long, O Lord, or where they're crying out to God about something that is happening. And there's some just general frustration and anger and sadness and just a lot of negative sort of feelings. I think for us, we tend to have this sort of idea that anything we can move past the painful feelings, the frustration, the uncomfortable places, anything that we can do to sort of just solve the problem is the right thing to do. But we don't always take the time to slow down and to sit in it a little bit, to reflect on it. And I think that's a key part to growing. It's a key part to changing. I don't think you can really move to a point where things reconcile, things get better without having that moment of grief and lament. It is so important. And it's more than just sitting there with your feelings. It's more than just the grief aspect. Lament is a time for us to actually grieve in community. It's a time for us to be together and listen to sort of just the tough things that people are dealing with. It's not rushed. And it's also a prayer. A lament is not just a cry out into the void. It's a cry that goes up to God. And this is key, I think. You know, we as Christians have this sort of faith tradition where not only do we reconcile with one another, we reconcile with God, and that's a key piece for us. How can we understand how to reconcile with one another if we can't understand how God's been reconciled to us? That's so important. And so I think that's a piece to moving in that direction, this sort of journey of reconciliation, this journey of coming together and moving forward to change to something that is a little different, but is perhaps better for everybody. It's a journey. When we move too quickly, when we don't take the time to reflect and to ask questions and to grieve and to be in that space, I think we cheapen this sort of sense of hope, the hope that is coming, by instead just sort of treating a problem, treating the symptom of a problem rather than the problem itself, taking the time to just, we're recognizing we don't see eye to eye. It's not just a matter of one issue. Oftentimes it's usually a series of issues. It's usually a difference in ideologies. It's usually something there that, if a relationship is broken, it's usually not one thing that has done it. It's typically a number of things. And so that time that allows us to grieve, that time that allows us to come together and sit with one another, is important. And it's moving towards something greater. In one of my classes today, we talked about the church and where the church is going. And, if you were to talk to anybody that is kind of aware of the institutional church, it's going through a pretty drastic change. It may look completely different in, a decade or two. Of course, Jesus assures us that the church isn't going anywhere, but what we may think is the church is subject to change, definitely. This sort of death and resurrection cycle. That's something that should be very familiar to us as Christians, is out of death comes new life. And so out of that grief and out of that pain and out of that hard time, it's not the end of it. We're coming to experience something more full, something more wondrous that God has planned for us. Another symbol of Veterans Day or Armistice Day, probably more appropriately named, is the symbol of the poppy flower. It's this red flower. Oftentimes you can use the seeds and put it on things like bagels or something to that effect. But it also has some medicinal history too. And it's been used a long time as a symbol for peace, as a symbol for death, but also resurrection. So that red color is a symbol that in many cultures that this is not the end, that there's something new. And it's oftentimes associated with Armistice Day, which I think is really appropriate. So what I leave you today with is just sort of thinking about the time to slow down, the time to breathe, the time to just sit and to reflect on everything that's kind of happened, and to kind of acknowledge that it's needed. The tough time is needed. The tough reflective time is needed to move forward. And it's okay. We don't have to fix the problems tomorrow, and the problems are still going to be there no matter how long. No matter how long we're here, there's going to be work to do. But it's important to take the time to slow down. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and go to God in prayer. Will you please pray with me? Gracious God, we thank you for the many blessings that you've given us. We give you thanks especially for those who have served our country and have kept us safe. We thank you that we have the blessings that you give us, our daily needs are provided for. We ask that you sit with us and help us to slow down, help us to grieve with one another in each other's sorrows. Help us to recognize that this is an extraordinary time. This is a tough time. Help us not to move past that or too quickly to a resolution. Give us ears to hear what others are dealing with and eyes to see struggles where they appear. Give us hands as well to do your work in this world. All this we ask in your most holy and precious name. Amen. Thank you all for joining me this week, and I hope to see you all very soon on Sunday. We'll have worship this week, and of course, feel free to reach out if you have any prayer requests or anything that you'd like to say in response to this video. Feel free to use the comment section below. Thank you all for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.